Okay. Hi, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. It's so great to see you.
Okay. So great to see you and hear your voice and see your maroon shirt. I feel like we've had matching maroon shirts in the past, but not today. So we actually are still in the middle of the Centurion story. First of all, I'll always note that the only time I'll say the word Centurion out loud, I feel, is if I'm reading, Matthew or the Gospel or Luke. It's very funny. There's a lot of vocabulary that we never say unless you read a Bible. Like for example, in English, we have the word myriad for one of the
Uh,
translations of the word in the Bible. I would never use the word myriad in real life, but it's one of those words that shows up all the time
and the word
in translation.
Capernaum, Capernaum, right?
Well,
What's this?
Capernaum. So
Capernaum.
if you're a tour guide in Israel, you Capernaum. Isaac, you should go the Israeli way. Kfar Nahum. You just work on that. Kfar Nahum, the village of Nahum. Maybe we should have a whole movement to stop calling it Capernaum and the name of
Capernaum.
that. There's so many cities that are hard to pronounce, and then you hear what they are originally, and they become a little bit more easy. And one of the funny names is was Sepphoris
Hmm.
is Sipori. So Sipor, my brother's name is Sipor, so it's like a
Hmm.
very easy name for me to say. But Sepphoris, almost like sulfur, it's a hard name. Anyways, so we're in the middle of the centurion servant. Jesus is about to do something to heal him, but we just finished in verse 9 that the centurion gave Jesus a speech, which is great. We don't generally see speeches of centurions. We wonder what language was it in? Was that in Greek? Was that in Aramaic? Probably. What was he saying? Anyways, so he gave a speech to Jesus. He tells him how to heal from afar. And let's hear what we're going to see in verse 10 is Jesus's response to being informed about how authority works.
I still find this so startling, right? Until you brought this out, where there's no reason for the centurion to be here in Galilee, but here in Capernaum, but here he is, and and so what's the reason behind the fact that that we can
Summer
learn
home,
that we
summer home. People love
Yes,
summer homes in Israel.
somewhere else. And the fact that, I mean, the way you explain this, where there's always something which can be learned, and the connections between the dignity and difference. I find that can insightful. Thank you. So, Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 8, verse 10. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly, I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. Wow, what a wonderful statement. I mean, for this person to hear from Jesus.
Yeah, he probably was a little bit elated. He probably felt firstly, he's not only that, but if you think about his emotional response, Jesus is it's very rare that we hear Jesus' emotional response about the gospel. If I told you how's Jesus feeling in general, you'd be like, I don't know. But the fact
No,
that
I think
Jesus
that
is amazed here, I think use the word marveled, but in
yeah,
my translation has amazed. And this is the only time in Matthew where Jesus is amazed at anything.
I think there are places where he says that he was angry, he was sad. I think, but in the case of Marvel, as being positively marveled, I think that this might be one of the few
But
instances.
usually Matthew doesn't talk about Jesus' emotions, like just as an
Yeah,
overarching
he's
theme. The fact
he's
is, the only time it talks about him being amazed. Um, the only other time it ever mentions him being me amazed was in Mark 6:6, where he's astonished by the unbelief of his hometown, of that people are unbelieving.
the rabbi. I want to ask you this before you ask me. The word faith. What does the word faith here mean
Oh
to
my
you?
God, that's obviously we'll talk about that today.
Yeah, so the when we read Matthew 8:1, when we on the topic of the leper, you asked me about the word clean, something I had not thought before, but he said, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And then here I noticed that he had faith. Jesus marveled that he's found no one with such faith. Um, my uh, my go-to definition is more Pauline faith as more abstract, but I would imagine
Okay,
that
Isaac,
faith.
let me hear some options. So you're pointing, obviously this is going to be our discussion today, and there's 2 points that we want to make about the faith, right? One, truly I tell you that no one in Israel have I found such faith. So in other words, he's saying that two things. Saying one, there's such a thing as faith, and we have to try to understand its definition and how it plays out. But then he's pointing out that he's condescending, speaking negatively, saying in Israel where one ought to expect to have such faith, either because they've been led by the Bible, or because they've been exposed to Jesus' teachings, or because they already have a rabbinic understanding of it. For whatever reason, they are lacking in it, and Jesus is surprised, or at least observing the fact that they don't have this faith. So I guess our opening question is, what does it mean to have faith? And I feel like generally you and I don't so often go through verses in the New Testament to figure out things, but I figured maybe to start, just because this is such a common theme in Matthew, maybe we'll read a couple of the other verses that mention faith in order to do like a comparative study to see. So let's do that to start. We're gonna, instead of me just switching to rabbinic texts, and I'll tell you why I'm not gonna do that after, let's switch to Matthew. So you can flip through the pages if you want. Let's start with
Yeah.
Matthew 6:30. I think that's the first time we mentioned faith. And there it says, um, is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into fire. Will he not much more clothe you, ye of little faith? Right? So over here, it's meant to be people not understanding how the world really works, right? I mean, we talked about this already, that the world works in a certain way, God acts in a certain way. If you understand God's relationship or the way that God controls the universe, you will have faith. But if you don't, you will not. So this is more of like an indictment about how people understand the world. So that'll be my interpretation. Would you like to add anything to that, Isaac?
No, I think no, that's I think I, that sounds great, right? In the context of Matthew 6, the verses 25 to 34, we spoke about faith and and we spoke about God's relationship with the world and how we don't understand this, and we also discussed this in Matthew 7 onwards, as where we have to keep asking. And I think that we discussed faith in that context as well, where he said you have to keep asking, but I will give. I can't find the word faith in it, but all those themes, the themes of Matthew 7 and of 6:25,
Well, I mean, we'll look at
they're
specific.
all similar.
There's so many times when he uses the word faith, we don't even have to generalize. The one thing I'll add about 6:30 is that he doesn't say he has no faith. Over there, he could have said, "You ye have no faith," but it says you have little faith. So it sounds like Jesus is able to differentiate between someone who has little faith, namely a lack of understanding of how the world works, versus no faith. Versus nice. So we'll keep that. Second example we have is our verse. So over here, we don't need to go much more in detail. The only thing we'll note is that A is to a non-Jew. A lot of times when we talk about the book of Matthew, we talk about, I guess one of the things that scholars want to talk about is what is the relationship of Matthew to the Jewish world? Is Matthew written in a time period when Christianity is completely broken off? Is Matthew written to a Jewish community who both identify as Christians and Jews? And again, there's scholars going in all directions, and I don't think we need to really go so far into that kind of conversation. But it's very clear that while Matthew has a very Jewish character, he seems to be very condescending to Jewish people, right? He's willing to say Centurion, who he heard one line of intelligence from, one smart thing. He goes, I've met 1 million Jews, and I've met one centurion who had one slave. And that centurion said something to me about how I should heal. And I happen to know that no one in Israel have I found such faith as you.
Well,
So
Rabbi, I think we're making multiple assumptions here, right? So we do not know how many people he had under his authority. The centurion, it could have been one, could have been could have been a whole.
what's the difference? I'm just saying how many. I'm saying Jesus met this guy and he heard
Yeah,
one thing from this guy,
yeah,
and he already says this guy has greater faith than all the tens of thousands of Jews who he met throughout his life,
fair enough. Yeah,
including the people who followed him
yeah.
after our lake stories, including the crowds who, you know, he literally just finished Sermon on the Mount with great crowds. He's saying this to great crowds probably. So he's looking at all the other people who maybe are a mixture of Jews and non-Jews, but definitely has Jews, and he's saying this random centurion is greater than all y'all. So I wanted to point out that this is a great example of Jesus's awkward, condescending, weird, uncomfortable relationship with the Jewish people in the first century. he doesn't look at them as a successful people according to this line. He doesn't look at
Fair
them
enough, yeah.
as someone who are really soaking up the Jews. And this is aside from the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the other scribes and the elders. This
Mhm.
is already the group of people where he's just saying every single Jew who I've ever met in my whole life, you're Centurion, you are better. And
So,
that's
Rabbi, I
yeah.
think that the way I read this is he's being subversive. He's pointing to a subversive way, he's pointing to a subversive definition of faith.
Oh,
And
we haven't defined faith yet. So
okay,
we're still
so
working on it. So,
okay,
but I'm
so
I'm happy to listen to what you think of the subversive. If you want to define your subversive definition of faith, I am all ears.
so I think so. So this person here, right, the centurion, he embodied um humility, meekness, because when he says, "Lord, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed." Blah blah blah. He goes on. So this to me points back to that's his cry for help, as in I can't help myself. I need your help. That's how I read verses 7, 8 onwards. Now that is a direct, or so this is how it's a direct, or it flows to Matthew 5:3, or the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus starts with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And so, what this person here, even though he has authority, he has a poor spirit, has meekness, and that seems to appeal to Jesus. And so maybe
Okay.
in that sense,
So
he's saying
so
that you
okay,
have more
let's
faith.
break down what you're saying.
Okay,
So I understood not like you. I haven't
okay,
defined faith yet, and
okay.
we've only gone through two verses from Matthew. But when I viewed faith, I viewed it not because he was acting meek, but because he gave sagacious advice about Jesus's powers, because that's what follows. So the centurion says, "I'm not worthy to come under your roof, but this is all you got to do." So I understood it was the vice. So you're saying it's more his faith is that he's humble or meek. I mean, that's possible. That is maybe I think I wouldn't use the word faith that way today. I say because I have faith, therefore I ought to act humble. But I wouldn't say being faithful is being humble, but it's possible. That's possible a definition. It doesn't like let's go through some more examples from Matthew, but that definitely is a possible read you're saying. So Matthew 6:30, I would say, as we said, Matthew 8:10, and then we have Matthew 8:26, which is coming up very soon, where he applied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. So over here we see a person just like our early one of little faith. Um, and this one, I think it's showing that fear and faith don't really work out. So I think that maybe is a support of you, Isaac, that it's showing that it's an emotional or self-definition. So I think like what we've seen is two ways in Matthew. We've seen where one is an understanding of God, and one is about how you see the world yourself. Okay, let's do a couple more, and then we'll call this a day of going through Matthew. Let's go to 9:20. Let's do 9:2. 9:2. Some men brought to him a paralyzed man lying on a mat. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the man, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven."
Mhm.
So over here, it's Jesus being able to see their faith. So again, like it's unclear what it means over here. All he saw is that they brought the paralyzed guy to Jesus. Maybe he's able to see something more so in that situation, but
So
it's unclear.
maybe is that what he's pointing to, faith, where where folks look up to him, or rely on him for his help, ask him, "Help me, I need your help." Maybe is that what he's pointing?
Yeah, that would make sense.
That's what he's
Seeing
pointing to,
Jesus
his
as a
definition of
leader.
faith.
Yeah, okay, that's possible. But we'll do one more example, even though we could do dozens more. And the next one I think is really interesting because it's very different. Like, and what we're both saying. 9:29. Then he touched their eyes. Oh, sorry, I went to 9:22. Sorry. Jesus turned and saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said. "Your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. So over here, we're seeing faith being something that heals. Unclear. So it doesn't look like Jesus, at least, is saying he didn't intervene in this way. And also 9:29, then he touched her eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." So again, we seeing Jesus kind of switching from people of little faith, people have faith in him, and now people have faith in themselves. Even in Matthew 13:58, he did not do miracles there because they're a lack of faith. So we see this dynamic coming up over and over, and we see little faith hope happening again in 14:31 and more healing. Okay, so over here, it's very interesting. It's very hard to know what it means, but it seems that faith is something that heals in and of itself, but faith, it could be either in Jesus, in the way that you live your life, or in the way that God acts, which is the first one that I think we see. And we see Jesus can't do miracles when you don't have faith. So this is something I think we'll have to keep our eyes open. I don't have a conclusion about what it means to have faith because it's unclear. But it's very, if it means just believing Jesus is a leader, then it's very easy to believe that the centurion has more faith, according to the story, than anyone in Israel. Because,
Yeah,
yeah.
I can't imagine how this would have come across the audience. To your point, he's met this one centurion and he's telling him, you have more faith than everyone in Israel, which is say you have more faith than everyone surrounding me, people I see, everyone over here, which could have come across as being very insulting to, insulting to his followers and the people around him. And maybe in that sense, he's pointing to, again, the way I read this is he's pointing to a subversive definition of faith, as in to maybe to faith as in do you
Well, you can't have subversive until you have versive. Well, what does faith mean? I'm not even sure.
Okay, so I think the faith would have meant earlier. The faith would have meant keeping the law, keeping the Torah, keeping Shabbos, keeping all that. But
I
now,
wouldn't. I don't think any Jew would call that faith.
so okay, isn't that so? What we call so? What we so the being a Jew, as in keeping Shabbos, keeping fasting, giving alms, keeping
But
kosher.
all the things Jesus advocates for, and not only that, he says very, very clearly that he's not. He says in 5:17, he's not even going to change any of that stuff.
Correct. And so yeah, so he says I didn't come here to abolish the law. And so no, so I think that the way I read this is to him faith, at least over here it means as in do you believe in me as Lord? And maybe that's his definition of faith. And here he sees here's this unknown person and a non-Jewish person, centurion person, um,
So I just want to again,
recognizes Jesus.
it's really interesting how we can't even get a very easy definition, but I want to like maybe throw out some modern ideas just to finish off on this. That number one, if you read a guy named Nachum Sarna, when he talked, he's a person who comments and writes a cultural context commentaries on the Bible, and he talks about there's no such idea as a proof of God in the Bible, at least the Old Testament,
Mhm.
because God is assumed throughout Genesis, throughout Exodus, and then God interacts as he sees fit, but it's assumed. So you can't have an idea of faith when someone is assumed. That's just a fact on the ground. Later on, though, especially in postmodern times, I mean, especially today, obviously, you do have this idea of is faith, meaning blind faith, believe even though you have no reason. There's nothing like nothing could prove you wrong. That'd be one way to see faith. Another way to see faith was that it makes sense to you. It's a faithfulness, like a state of mind. It's like you have belief in something because the evidence points to you. So there's no leap of faith, but there's a certain amount of evidence around that would show you that you should do that. It's really interesting when you look at the Talmud, there's very few stories about faith a la faith. If anything, the idea of having faith, which we'll say in Hebrew be emunah, um, is not something that I think Jews were very overly thoughtful of. And I think this is where I want to see the contrast of New Testament to Rabbinic Judaism. I don't think Jews cared about faith that much. Jews didn't care about trying to make sure that you have the right attitude towards a leader, if it means a leader, as you're saying, or the right attitude, it means that you be meek because you have faith. You be meek, or you should be humble because you ought to be humble, because that's the right way to stand before God, but not because that means to have faith. And the last one where we talk about having blind faith, it doesn't. That's not like a concept that comes up very often. I think Jews were very certain of their identity and of their religion, and this wasn't something that they would have spoken about. The idea of having someone saying that you have to jump on board in order to believe in something means there's a transition happening. And
Mm.
it would make sense that the people in Israel wouldn't have faith if it means transitioning to a new kind of system of belief or believing something about someone. So I think you look at faith that way, that there's a transition from Moses to Eliyahu, and now they want a Jesus figure. I'd say, yeah, this is a correct observation. Probably no person in Israel had such faith as a centurion, because the centurion would have had a much different cultural context of seeing the importance of demigods, gods, and having how they interact from a cultural context. Jews would not have been able to see an individual be able to carry out, let's say, miracles or special things, and use that as a proof to augment their religion.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good observation. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. On that note, Isaac, there's our one verse. I'm sorry we couldn't give a formal
But
Matthew
so,
definition
but
of faith.
so, Rabbi, but on that, isn't that subversive in and of itself, right? So he's preaching to preaching to to a Jewish audience, and and I think, but in some ways, so earlier we read how, um, well, I need to think about this a bit, right? So, the centurion had the cultural context to look at Jesus as a master, as Lord, but his Jewish audience might not have had the context to look at this. But isn't that, and if Jesus is favoring one or the other, that would have come across as being confusing to his audience, and very confusing, as in
I mean,
so
I don't
far
know,
after what
maybe.
they've known, and that, so wouldn't that be the
I don't think it
subversive
would have been
part of it?
confusing in that there was no shortage of like deified physical idols and beings in the first century Israel. They would have been able to see, Roman religion around, and they would have been able to see secular, or I guess pagan religion around. So I don't think these concepts would have been foreign. I just think that a leap of faith wouldn't take place because of any of these things that they're seeing. But the centurion, because of his pagan background, it'd be very easy to say that he is the greatest believer. Even more so. I guess let me ask you this. You read this and you know that he already had conversations, by the lake with people who are super, I don't know, he has such, he met John the Baptist. I don't know. John the Baptist, he met really, really important people before this, and he has people following him, and we already know who James is. We already know, like, I don't know, like Joseph. What about Mary? Mary's in Israel. Does Mary have like little faith? What about James? James and John, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Like, do they have less faith than the centurion at this point? How could Simon or Andrew, all people who we saw in Matthew 4:18 through 4:22, like, how could the evangelist write this about the centurion? Let me ask you that. How could he say this about the centurion when we know that Joseph, Mary, Simon, Peter, and Andrew, same person, James, and John, all are mentioned as characters in the gospel according to Matthew by now?
Well,
How
Rabbi,
do
and
you explain that?
and to add more context to this, right? If Matthew was written first century, like 80, well, first century again in 85, or the first century BC, first century after after Jesus, and then where anti-Semitism was at its highest, and Jews were being killed, and if Matthew is again, the author of Matthew is placing the centurion there and saying he has faith, that would have been so that would have
Okay,
been
we
so,
said that in the past. Okay, so instead of answering my question, Isaac, you decide to strengthen my question.
yeah, that's right. I
I,
started question,
thank you.
which
That's very
again,
kind of you.
which all then points to the dignity of difference. At least the way I read this as in, I can't imagine. I
But
can't
it's
imagine.
okay, Isaac. Can you even say so? You're trying to cite Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, dignity of difference, that you could pop out truths from other religions. Is that really what's happening here? Are we looking at pagan Roman religion and saying let's pop out some truths, or they're saying the centurion really is jumping onto the Christian bandwagon? I don't think there's a dignity of difference that they're looking at his culture, and saying this is great. I think they're just saying like you're better than all the Jews. Again, like Isaac, I'm gonna leave you this question because I don't think it's a good answer. I want you to ponder this question because this question might be the root of all anti-Semitism, right? You got a bunch of awesome Jews coming along, and then still you like the goy better. I don't know. So it's a great question, and I think that maybe the rest of your life, I encourage you to every time you go to church and they mention Matthew, say, "How could Centurion have better faith than anyone in the land of Israel at that time when Jesus already interacted with so many
Yeah.
highfalutin
That's
Jews?"
a that's a very fair question. So could it be that the author of Matthew, he was discerning his own faith and his own heritage, and that is playing out in this
So
way?
if you look at the academics on when, how, up, down Matthew's written, it's really like there's five main opinions I saw about like who the community is. Was it before Christian separation with the Jews? After? So I don't want to make any arguments based on the reality of that, but this is a weird line, Isaac, to say the least. Okay, let's call it a day, Isaac.
Okay,
Uh,
Rabbi, on that note, thank you.
no problem. Okay.